this has always been Putin's strategy and his strength, that he plays the bad boy, he plays the out of control bully and expects us to be the adults in the room.
The speech by Putin, it seems striking to me of things it didn't really contain. There was some talk of him declaring all-out war on Ukraine. He didn't do that. He didn't make much of nuclear threats or anything like that. It seemed to be just a restatement, essentially, of his position that this was a necessary war against Ukraine because Ukraine and NATO behind it was threatening Russian interests.
Yes, look, this was never going to be a big programmatic statement, and that's not really the role of his speech on Victory Day. And in any case, the idea of him declaring mobilization and scaling up his quote unquote special military operation to a war would in effect have been admitting defeat. And the last day you want to be doing that is on Victory Day. So instead, as you say, we got the usual stuff, but I would say that the rhetoric was in a way dialed up to 11. It was essentially about how the Western world is all against us. We face proxy war. The neo-Nazis, as he put them, of the Ukrainian government, they were thinking about getting nuclear weapons. I mean, a lot of truly preposterous nonsense. But that's the whole thing. Because he doesn't actually have a victory to announce, all he can do is just rely on this very extreme propagandistic message.
And how impressive is it? It's a big sign of military might, but it contrasts, I suppose, to Russian tanks being driven away by Ukrainians in tractors or people stuck in the mud. Is there a big contrast between the show and the reality when it comes to the might of the Russian army?
There is. I mean, we should remember, for example, that there are two divisions that are based just outside Moscow, and they provide a lot of the men and the materiel for the march. And they spend much of their year precisely practicing. So they are absolutely pitch perfect in terms of the way that they goose step across the square, but that doesn't necessarily translate into combat effectiveness. Now, look, we shouldn't downplay the Russian military strength too much. I mean, it's a danger of making them sound like the sort of military Keystone Cops.
Yeah.
In part, they were hamstrung by the way that Putin imposed a totally ludicrous strategy on them. And so their best troops and their best chance at a quick victory was wasted, frankly, by Putin. But nonetheless, yes, all the various deep-seated problems of the Russian military that, frankly, we also saw in the Soviet military, corruption, indiscipline, all these sorts of things are really playing themselves out very strikingly in Ukraine today.
But they have numbers, and that was the lesson, I suppose, of the Second World War, wasn't it? 25 million people died, but they had those numbers of people willing to die, and they won by a war of attrition to a certain extent, I suppose. And is that possible in Ukraine, that they might not have brilliant leadership, they might have poor strategy, they might have had a failing battle plan, but if they've got commitment and a willingness to proceed with a war of attrition, that can be very, very dangerous for Ukraine.
Look, it's clearly terribly dangerous already. But we've got to remember, at the moment, this is in effect a peacetime Russian army. It's not fully manned. I mean, this is one of the reasons why we have seen, for example, not many infantry out in the field. It's because they simply don't have enough infantry to be putting out there. And then this is one of the kind of complaints from the generals, and one of the reasons why there's talk about a wider mobilization. Because at present, the Russians just don't have the manpower to win in Ukraine. On the other hand, they do have the manpower to hold on in Ukraine. And I think this is the problem. We're heading towards a situation, probably even if Putin does declare some kind of mobilization, in which neither Kyiv nor Moscow can deliver a knockout blow. Both of them are strong enough to actually be able to hold on in this war, but neither of them are strong enough to actually win. So I think the thought of some sort of massive Russian steamroller moving across Ukraine, particularly now that the Ukrainians are being equipped with NATO standard weaponry, is, I think, increasingly less likely. But the point is that doesn't mean the war's going to end, quite the opposite.
We read this weekend in the Sunday Times, Christina Lamb writing about the rape of women and the murder of civilians by Russian forces. The Red Army was notorious for the rapes that they committed as they came across into Berlin in the Second World War. Is rape by the Russian army, is it a weapon of war? Is it something when the men out of control are doing? Is it something that's seen as part of the terror of war that they want to bring to a country?
I don't think this is policy. I mean, in some ways, one absolutely can criticize the Kremlin for failing to rein in its own people. It's worth noting that a few years ago, they actually created a specialist military police force, which they hadn't had until then, precisely to try and discipline this exceedingly undisciplined military. And one of the things that's very striking is that there's been a few cases of military police casualties, but very, very little signs of them actually being there. And we're seeing this. We're seeing this in the extraordinary brutality. But I said, I think that this is more a sign of a very, very toxic and unpleasant military culture, a sign of very poor disciplinary systems, and also the response when soldiers who didn't think they would be fighting, or they thought that they would be having an easy win, suddenly find themselves in a very different position. They feel angry, they feel scared, and that tends to unfortunately manifest itself in these ghastly ways. So, I mean, I think it's a terrible side effect of what happens when you have this kind of a war and this kind of an army.
Mark, can I ask you about I don't know if there is such a thing as the ordinary Russian, but Russian people watching this on television, are they caught up in this? Are they alive to the fact that there might be more to this than meets the eye? Or is it a kind of siege mentality? You know, everyone hates us, so let's band together and be militarily strong. Or is it none of the above?
Well, actually, I think it's both of the above. I mean, I think this is it. We're beginning to see, and it's very hard. I mean, there's some opinion polling and some anecdotal stuff one can get from, for example, social media channels. We're beginning to see, I think, the slow spread of a realization that what's happening in Ukraine is not exactly what they're being told on state TV. And remember, the Putin regime has now moved to squeeze out the very last vestiges of independent media that's left. But the point is that can coexist with that sense of being beleaguered. If I talk to my friends who are still in Moscow, who are pretty much by definition West-looking, educated, middle-class Russians, not friends of Putin, and they can be terribly opposed to the war, and they are. But on the other hand, when they find that there's not medicines in the shops, or the inflation is going up because of sanctions, actually, to an extent, they blame us, not Putin. And it's, again, a very sort of human response. So I think we're beginning to see the dawning realization amongst Russians of what's going on in Ukraine. And the more people come back with stories from the front line or come back in zinc boxes, then in a way that will spread. But so far, at least, one thing that the Kremlin has been able to do is in some ways stop people from joining the dots and realizing just how big and just how disastrous this war really is. But that will come.
Do you think we perform us a bit of a poor service in the West by talking him up so much that we've got it's in lots of people's interest to talk of the threat of Putin, and people do that all the time for domestic politics reasons, perhaps. You know, we're talking about NATO, Finland and Sweden now making a decision to join NATO, and yet the evidence on the ground is that when Russia was asked or decided rather to show its military force in Ukraine, it didn't do it very well. It didn't have air command. Its army has performed poorly. And actually, we've partially added to the myth of the strength of Russia in the same way that Putin does.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this has always been Putin's strategy and his strength, that he plays the bad boy. He plays the out of control bully and expects us to be the adults in the room. And up to now, it's tended to be really quite carefully calibrated, but also really quite effective. There is this sense of, oh my gosh, the Russians, Putin can do anything. He's behind everything that we don't like that happens in the West. We have a tendency to assume that he has almost magical powers of mind control, whether it's in terms of electing Trump or whatever else. And also that precisely Putin is so dangerous that we need to make some kind of a deal with him. That's absolutely something that the Russians played on, because they lack military power, really. They lack economic power. They certainly lack soft power. So in some ways, they went for this kind of dark power of being just too intimidating. Now, though, we have seen a very obvious test of these capabilities and this strategy. And it's been demonstrated that Putin is, firstly, nothing like this sort of grand master of three-dimensional geopolitical chess that some people assumed. And likewise, in a way, his last real trump card, his military, is much, much less effective than it was, and frankly is now engaged. I mean, 20 years of military modernization was in many ways burnt through in 20 days of bad fighting. So I think in this respect, we have tended to give Putin much more credit than he deserves. And in the process, we have also allowed ourselves to alienate a lot of ordinary Russians because we had treated them all the same. Whereas we actually needed to treat Putin with less respect and ordinary Russians with perhaps a little bit more.
That's fascinating, and how you deal with someone who seems out of control is a really difficult question that gets addressed in geopolitics all the time, and whether we're addressing it correctly with Putin is a question without an answer just yet. Fascinating stuff, Mark. Great to speak to you. That's Mark Galeotti, honorary professor at University College London, author of The Weaponization of Everything.